Okay, we will go ahead and get started. So first of all, welcome. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Johanna Kao, and I am the Regional Director for the Asia Pacific here at the International Republican Institute. And so, on behalf of IRI and Hong Kong Watch, we're really pleased to welcome you all to the launch of this report by Hong Kong Watch titled Passively Supporting Oppression: Why Wall Street and Bay Street's approach to equities and bond investment in China is incompatible with its ESG commitments, which is a mouthful. But I think gives you a sense of I was just talking to Joey about just how much information Hong Kong Watch has garnered and gathered through its research. And so we're going to do our best to scratch the surface of some of that today, but definitely do encourage you to read the report. So just briefly, for our run of show for this afternoon, we're going to spend the first part of the program in discussion with one of the authors of the report, really just to dive into it a bit and get a bit of an overview of it. And then we're really pleased we're going to be inviting some incredible panelists up to join us as well to just have a broader discussion on some of these topics. So for this first part, I'm really pleased to be joined by Sam Goodman, who is the Director of Policy and Advocacy of Hong Kong Watch and one of the authors of the report. Prior to joining Hong Kong Watch, Sam worked as a political advisor for the Labour Party, as a parliamentary aide to several Labour members of Parliament, and worked here in the US in the House of Representatives for Congressman Bobby Rush. So, Sam, thank you.
Sure.
Welcome. We're glad you're here today.
Thanks for having me.
So to get us started, I thought it might be good if you could provide just a brief introduction to Hong Kong Watch itself and its mission, and then to get a bit into the meat of the report, if you can describe the purpose, why now, why this report, and why did you feel it was important to be addressing passive investment?
Sure. So Hong Kong Watch, if you don't know us, is a UK-based NGO that focuses on the human rights situation in Hong Kong. And we were founded by Benedict Rogers, who used to be a journalist in Hong Kong, who was actually the first foreigner to be denied entry to the city. And that actually was the impetus for us forming back in 2017. We undertake advocacy work in the UK, in Europe, in Canada, here in America. We do bits and pieces in Australia. And now this report itself is sort of the second iteration of a series that we've done looking at China, ESG, and human rights. And really, it comes from a series where, first of all, we looked at what the value of Hong Kong was as a financial center to China. This is back in 2019. We then moved to discussing the sort of influence that finance from the mainland was having on Hong Kong's autonomy, how it was eroding the democratic structures. And then this naturally led us to talking about this question of ESG investment in China itself. And last year, we published a report where we looked at Western pension funds that were investing in either stocks that have been sanctioned or blacklisted by the USA, by the two executive orders, one signed by Donald Trump and one signed by Joe Biden. And then we also looked at Alibaba and Tencent, who are not sanctioned or blacklisted, but certainly complicit in gross human rights violations. Just because of the sheer size of money that we noticed was really going from Western pension funds into Alibaba and Tencent. And now in the last year, we started talking to some of these pension funds. And what we found out with many of them is that the reason they were exposed is because they were passively invested, i.e. they were tracking index market trackers, MSCI's Emerging Markets Index or Vanguard's Emerging Market Index. And therefore, that's how they were exposed. So Vanguard and MSCI were making the decisions of the companies that were in the fund, and the pension fund was handing off some of their money to be managed by them. Now, this report finds, looking at state pension funds in this country, that 6 of the largest state pension funds are exposed to 7 companies that have been blacklisted by the United States, either for their links to the concentration camps in Xinjiang or their links to the People's Liberation Army. Now, that includes companies like Dahua Technology, which is a Chinese technology surveillance company that's produced cameras that are in the concentration camps that are designed to target Uyghurs based on their physical features, or iFlyTech, which is an audio recording company that's been working with the police force in Xinjiang to build a database, an audio recording database of Uyghurs' voices. So these are not particularly nice companies, they're pretty terrible. And we think that, unfortunately, these pension funds and these market index trackers are really taking advantage of this loophole because their MSCI and BlackRock and Vanguard are not currently forced to divest from companies that are blacklisted, while they have been forced to divest from companies that are sanctioned.
Thanks for that. I mean, reading through the report, I was really struck at how it describes this sort of untenable situation, right? Where you have leading figures in institutions, in financial institutions, driving a push for ESG. And at the same time, promoting greater access to China's market, right? By working with US government, the Chinese government, index providers, as you described, and others to sort of deepen these ties with China. So, we have deepening and it seems accelerating investments that are increasingly exposed to the China market, which is under the control of the Chinese Communist Party, which is hostile to human rights. So, and at the same time, these finance firms are trying to move trillions of dollars. And so, you can see why they're drawn to the scale of, the world's second largest economy. But, I think what this report does really well is really draw those connections between the human, environmental, and social costs of these investments. And so, part of what I wanted to get into is sort of two related questions. I guess one is when we're thinking about the lobbying activities of these firms themselves, what can be done, do you think, to increase scrutiny of the positions and the lobbying, the positions that are being taken and the lobbying that's being done by these finance firms, by these groups, first, and then secondly, how to raise awareness about the regulatory investment-based ESG risks that are connected with investments in China?
Well, I mean, first of all, I think any exposure on the behavior of companies like BlackRock when it comes to privately lobbying government is welcome. And I think it should be done on the merits, not only that some of the investments are unethical, but also there are real governance issues here as well. And if you look at the example of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, BlackRock bet against Western sanctions. They basically were telling their investors a week before Russia rolled its tanks into Ukraine that they should invest in Russian gold, they should invest in Russian oil and gas, and they should invest in Russian arms. And they lost $17 billion of their investors' money. So there's a real question about the credibility of the advice of some of these financial companies. But you are right that they have been actively lobbying for the last 5 years, many of these index providers, to create a greater weight for China in emerging markets portfolios. That now means that if you're looking at MSCI emerging markets, a third of their portfolio is now weighted towards China. That's a huge amount of passive investment going to China, going to some of these companies. While at the same time, some of these companies, these US financial companies, are getting preferential access in China. Now, I can't necessarily draw a direct link between these two things happening, because I don't want to get in trouble, but I think these are certainly something that should be looked at. But I think you're right. Like, we're often asked, particularly, why are you focusing on ESG? Like, why are you bringing this up as a human rights organization? And my counter argument with some of these pension funds is that we didn't start this conversation; they did. There are more people getting into sustainable finance today than there ever has been. It's a huge popular demand from it, and they're profiting from it. And they refuse to allow it to be the industry to be regulated properly, and that is a problem. And I think the report certainly advocates a pathway forward, potentially in the next Congress, for legislation of some kind. Whether that is transparency, making these funds do proper due diligence to see if these stocks are exposed to Xinjiang, but also whether there should be some sort of punitive penalties as well. I note the case recently of New York Mellon Bank, and they were fined $1.5 million because they're essentially mis-selling a product, an ESG product. Now, I think if you have more of that when it comes to some of the social elements in these products, I think it would be an effective signal to some of these companies about their behavior.
You mentioned these pension funds, right? And that's a big focus here. If you were talking to the chief investment officer of, one of these big state pension funds like CalPERS, right?
Sure.
So, somebody who's sitting on $500 billion in assets, what would you ask them? What would you be asking them to do?
I mean, first of all, I would ask them whether they actually know where they're investing their money. And I would be probably very surprised or unsurprised to find out that they don't. So I think the recognition here is that they need to be taking a more active position in the management of their own pension funds. At the moment, they're farming it out to some of these index trackers, to some of these financial firms, and just telling them to get on with it. And I don't think that that's an effective model, and I certainly don't think it's sustainable.
And I guess on those same lines, if you were speaking to, as some of the recommendations in the report are, to the heads of financial regulatory authorities here in the US or Canada or the UK, what would you want to highlight to them from the report?
Yeah, I mean, I think highlighting the inconsistencies really between what these companies say that they do, their ESG obligations, and to looking at the details of some of the funds that they're selling today and the exposure that it's leading to for US state pension funds and also for college endowment funds, which we've also talked about. In the report.
Yeah, we do. All right, I want to pause here because we are going to sort of now draw in our panelists. So I'd like to invite our panelists to come up and join us. As they are, Sam, is there anything else from the report you'd like to highlight before we get into the rest of the discussion?
I mean, I think a broader point in the report is also this question about Chinese sovereign government bonds. And I think that's a more complicated conversation to have. But I think if you look at last year, investment into Chinese government bonds total 3 trillion renminbi. And I think we're now having a more sensible discussion about the incoherence of the previous Western approach vis-a-vis China, where it was, we will buy Russian oil and gas, but we will arm the Ukrainian troops, even though we know that this money is going to finance Russia's war effort. Well, I think a similar argument can be made to some of the Chinese government spending that they will receive from these bonds when it comes to the modernization of the PLA, so they can threaten Taiwan, the maintenance of these camps, and the oversized national security budget you now see in Hong Kong that's being used to justify the arrest of pro-democracy activists. There is an incoherence here. And I think in terms of bonds, I think there's a wider question about whether investing in Chinese government bonds would ever meet ESG obligations. See, we would say probably not.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Thank you for that. All right. So really pleased to welcome now our other panelists who've joined us, and I'll just briefly introduce them. So starting from my far left, Isaac Stone-Fish, who is the founder and CEO of Strategy Risks, which is a firm that quantifies corporate exposure to China. His analysis of international affairs and US-China relations is published widely in the US and around the world. He is also an adjunct at New York University Center for Global Affairs, a visiting fellow at the Atlantic Council, a columnist on China risk at Barron's, and has served as Foreign Policy Magazine's Asia editor. Prior to joining Foreign Policy, he spent 7 years living in China, including as the Beijing correspondent for Newsweek magazine. And is a fluent Mandarin speaker, which enabled him to really travel throughout the country, which I think has given him some incredibly unique insights, which come through in a lot of his writing. Next across the table is Ambassador Kelley Currie, who served as the US Ambassador at Large for Global Women's Issues and as the US representative at the UN's Commission on the Status of Women. Prior to that appointment, she led the Department of State's Office of Global Criminal Justice, and also served under Ambassador Nikki Haley as the US representative to the UN Economic and Social Council and alternative representative to the UN General Assembly. Throughout an incredible career in foreign policy, Ambassador Currie has specialized in human rights, political reform, development, and humanitarian issues with a focus on the Asia-Pacific region. And I will also add that she was my first boss at IRI. And so I can speak to with just firsthand knowledge to the passion and the dedication that she brings to this work. And then last, not least, Dennis Kwok, who is a founding member of the Civic Party in Hong Kong. In 2012, he was elected as the member of the Hong Kong Legislative Council, representing the legal profession. During his time in office, he was very actively engaged in international advocacy work for Hong Kong's democratic movement. He was one of the principal advocates and activists against the Hong Kong government's proposed 2019 extradition bill. And then after Beijing imposed the national security law in Hong Kong in 2020, he, like other democratic activists, was forced to leave Hong Kong. So he now lives in exile here in the US, where he's a senior fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School. And his current research focuses on the legal and political risks emerging from China from the perspectives of international business and NGOs.
You forgot to say I was booted out of office.
And he was booted out of office. Thank you. So what we're going to be doing is we have a bit of a sort of some guided questions that our team here has pulled together for the panelists. It's meant to be a bit of an informal conversation to get things going, and then we will definitely be leaving time to open up for questions from all of you. So to get us started, Ambassador Currie, I'd like to kind of get going with you, because, you know, I know that you've looked at the issues in this report through a few different lenses, right? From both the government and the non-government sides. And I'm guessing a lot of what's covered in this report is going to track with your own analysis and research. And so, you know, picking up on the last couple of questions, the discussion with Sam on sort of what would be sort of compelling ways to talk to you know, some of these pension funds about these issues. You know, I'd like to ask you to use your lens, put on your hat as a former government official. What is the most impactful way that advocacy like this can be presented to policymakers in the US government? What about a report like this? How would it be made compelling to policymakers here?
Thank you, Joe. And also congratulations to Hong Kong Watch on another excellent report on a topic that we do have a lot of shared interest in. And I appreciated their previous report in this series on ESG. I've been working on this issue as well. And we've been having a great dialogue back and forth talking about the problem here that they focus on, this massive hypocrisy, this delta between what investment managers and the financial sector, financial services sector talks about when they talk about ESG and when they talk about ESG investment, and what really it looks like on the ground, and the difference between how, for instance, the environmental sector is weighted in ESG versus human rights issues, and this massive chasm between the treatment of these issues. It's a huge problem, and there has not been enough attention paid to it. So the reporting alone that Hong Kong Watch is doing on this and calling attention to this is helpful in terms of having actual data to go in and talk to people, including to government officials. So just getting more data out there, getting more facts and figures. And I'm looking over at my friend and another partner in crime, Robbie Smith from the Coalition for a Prosperous America, and friends at Uyghur Human Rights Project, friends at the Sheffield University in the UK that are really exposing the problem here of these companies, these entities that are getting capital from US and other Western financial capital markets that are involved in gross violations of human rights that threaten our national security, threaten our economic security. And so the first big piece of it has been to collect the information and really highlight the problem, because you can't solve a problem that you don't know exists. So that's really been making policymakers aware that there is this massive problem. That has slowly been building. I think you see now in Congress. I know that in the executive branch, we were very seized with that, with this issue, and had some real activist people in the executive branch who were willing to go out and do things like, you know, send business advisories to businesses saying, you've got a problem with your supply chain, you've got a problem with the companies that are listed in your indexes, or whatever the issue was, and whatever the industry was, alerting them to the fact that they have a problem and that they are opening themselves up to, whether it's geopolitical risk that you've talked about, or risk of losing investors' money, which is the only thing they really care about, that they will get blamed for the financial costs. And so I think that you're seeing a convergence of a lot of things that are getting policymakers' attentions. Then the key is also to have specific actionable things that they can do about it once they realize that there is a problem, and really have that pressure. I think that what we've seen is that, and if you look at the executive branch of the United States, and I think that the situation in the UK is fairly similar, and also in all of the Five Eyes countries, I would say it's, and in the Europeans, it's fairly similar. You have the popular branches of government that are closest to the people, that are more responsive to the concerns of average citizens, who are far ahead on these issues than much further ahead on these issues than the administrative sides of the equation, the executive branches in these countries. And so learning, I think, I think the advocacy groups have done an amazing job of educating members of Congress and their staff about this and making sure that they are putting a lot more pressure on the executive branch to actually act. And then you see within our executive branch, you have a real problem with the agencies in our system that I would say, I don't think it's an understatement to say that they are basically captured by the financial services agents, by the financial services industry. And there I would put the Treasury Department, the Securities and Exchange Commission, basically the very agencies of government that are meant to stop this kind of stuff and to protect investors, in particular the SEC and the PCAOB. And I would even say, we're right now we're in the middle of this huge kind of educational effort to get the tiny little executive branch agency that runs the federal government's 401k to understand that they cannot put federal 401k funds into Chinese entities. Like, you would think that this would be a no-brainer. This is literally our military and federal workers 401ks, and the agency that is in charge of that, which has BlackRock as their investment manager, and which seems to be more interested in listening to BlackRock than protecting the interests of their participants or reflecting U.S. national security concerns, is just like, yeah, we're just here to make money. I'm like, actually, no, you're not just here to make money. You're not Charles Schwab. You're the federal government's 401k. There's a difference. They don't want to hear it. So it's not easy. I guess that's one thing to say, I think, but educating, using those leverages, that leverage of public pressure and the representative institutions in our political systems to put pressure on the more attenuated ones that are right now being very responsive to Wall Street and much more concerned about what Wall Street wants than they are about what's the right thing to do in these situations. And then making sure you do have actionable things that can be done. And if they won't do them on their own, then going back to those representative bodies and getting legislation put in place, because a lot of times, and you hear this from companies too, I'm sure Isaac can relate to this, that companies are like, well, if it's the law, we'll do it. But they're not going to do it on their own. And I think that's where, you can't rely on anybody's goodwill or, good intentions in this. I think you have to really think about how you target through specific legal obligations. And a lot of this is going to be about changing, the whole idea of the fiduciary in the United States is under a lot of pressure right now because of ESG and what ESG means for what fiduciary duties are. And there's a lot of tension going on around this. At the state level, we're seeing a lot of pushback on ESG agendas in Republican and red states. You're seeing pushback from the governments in those states on ESG agendas. And meanwhile, in blue states, there's a different political dynamic there around ESG not being robust enough, but it's only about the environment. It's not really about human rights. So, there are two different angles there too, politically, that you have to think about. I'll stop there.
Thank you. That's a really great sort of intro into a lot of the issues that I think we're going to be covering today. So actually, I do want to pick up, Isaac, on what Ambassador Currie just mentioned about what motivates business to move. So we saw last fall that George Soros read a piece in the Wall Street Journal, right, advising Western investors to stay away from the Chinese markets because, the CCP can't be trusted. And your book, America Second, gets into how the CCP has sought to exert influence here as part of its own strategic goal of having, a compliant US as number two to them. So in the context of your own research and then this report, short of what Ambassador Currie was talking about of, if it's the law, companies will follow it, what does need to be done to get investors to recognize that divesting from China is actually in their own interests as well as national security interests? What about this work would they find compelling?
Thank you. And thank you for the fascinating research, Sam. So we're in the midst of a major cultural shift in the United States, and it's starting to happen in the China space as well. For so long, boards of major companies would say things like, well, I just got off the phone with Dr. Kissinger, and he said we should double our investment in China for XYZ reason. And I think in DC, people focus publicly on the policy. Privately, they'll talk a lot about how personnel makes policy, but there's this lack of willingness to go after a lot of sacred names who are part of the reason, in fact, a large part of the reason that we're here in the first place. So, folks on the boards of all of the institutions that we're part of, the Albrights and the Cohens and the Kissingers of the world, because for so long, these folks gave cover to individual investors and companies to further engage with China in ways that sometimes were advantageous to shareholders and sometimes were not. So in terms of what the solutions are, a lot of times transparency, as bald and boring as it sounds, is really phenomenal for these things, because when you learn that, say, David Rubenstein was an official advisor to the Beijing government, you think, oh, maybe he should register with FARA for that. Or Schwartzman, who partners with the Chinese Communist Party in a lot of different ways, say via Tsinghua University, which is a party institution, very explicitly, you should register with FARA. And the cost of registering with FARA and the cost of a lot of these things are what I would say the most effective measure beyond laws, and that's embarrassment. And I think the most poignant lever that we have besides, hey, if you do this, you'll go to jail, is, hey, if you do this, you're not going to get as good dinner invitations that you were before. Yes, making less money, and I'll get into that in a second, is a big piece of that, but really don't underestimate the, oh, I'm on the board of Schwartzman. Oh, Schwartzman partners with the Chinese Communist Party. People don't like that. It makes people really uncomfortable to be challenged for the causes that they support, the charities they work in. And I was having a conversation, we were talking about companies, I was having a conversation with someone who's on the board of a major investment firm, which rhymes with sad sock, and sort of. And they were saying how this company lost $1 billion in China, but the $1 billion doesn't really matter to them. They'll invest in China because that's just a rounding error for them. But what does matter is their brand equity, because if this company that might have just been mentioned by Kelley has a lot of partnerships with US government institutions, if their brand equity is worse, they will lose some of those partnerships. That has a very concrete piece on their bottom line. So in terms of the actual bottom line way here, there's a reason that a lot of people have invested in China for so long. And it's not just because Henry Kissinger asked them to, it's because it's financially been a very smart investment for a lot of folks. But what often gets missed from that debate is not the alpha, but the beta, the risk of that investment. And a lot of these companies have a fiduciary duty to manage the risks of the investment. And so it's not, oh, I'm going to invest in China, I'm going to make 5 or 10% a year. It's some investments do better than that, some do worse. And there's such a focus in the narrative on the successes that we very elegantly forget a lot of the failures. And my favorite example for this is American Express, which has spent hundreds of millions of dollars trying to get into the booming Chinese mobile pay and pay market, and now has a 0.0 market share in China. Is that true of every company that invests in China? Absolutely not. But it's true of a lot of companies, and it's a reason why companies need to be pushed to better manage their own risk. That delivers better value to their shareholders, and it's a narrative that also helps with the work that we're doing here.
And so, and we'll probably come back to this. I guess the question is how to make that connection for companies.
So again, I really don't want to underestimate the value of people talking to their boards. So much of this is, oh, my CEO just had dinner with X and they said this, or, oh, we just got this person to go speak at the board and he said this, or, oh, we need to go talk to more Congress people and they're giving us a really hard time about this plant that we have in Qingdao. How much is this plant in Qingdao worth? Oh, it's only $10 million a year. Okay, just get rid of it. I don't want to get these embarrassing questions. Or, oh gosh, if we do this, my CEO is going to have to prepare for a testimony to Congress. That's very valuable for a company to not have to do because it takes a lot of executive time. And that's something that's very valuable, both from a company's perspective, but also people in the company under the CEO don't want to be blamed for Rubio asking embarrassing questions to the CEO.
Thank you. So I just want to move to talk about these ESG indexes themselves, because it's been raised by a couple of people already, just sort of what a mess they are. And so Dennis, I want to start with you because we know the industry, these standards, they lack consistency, right, between index providers, between pension funds, between asset managers. I think that's probably how a lot of these Chinese companies that are facilitating human rights violations are getting onto these lists. So your experience, right? You did a lot of work lobbying the Hong Kong Stock Exchange in the past to enhance their ESG disclosure requirements, right? And so I think it'd be interesting if you can talk a bit about that experience, and really, are there some lessons from that advocates here in the US and in other countries could learn from the experience that you had of how to effect that disclosure?
Yeah. So thanks for Hong Kong Watch for doing this excellent work. Sam and I have been doing quite a lot of writing on ESG related issues over the past year. And I think it is important for Hong Kong Watch to start this conversation, because when I was a lawmaker in Hong Kong, we co-sponsor a private member's bill called the Hong Kong Modern Slavery Bill, which is premised on the UK Modern Slavery Act and also the Australian one. But legislation is a very slow and painful process. And in the Hong Kong Legislative Council, there was simply no appetite, especially not from the pro-Beijing camp, to consider anything like the Modern Slavery Act. But we push ahead with it because it created a focal point for people who care about modern slavery to look at these issues from all around. And we managed to do that with a private members bill because the Hong Kong government knows this is becoming a bigger and bigger issue, especially for Asia, because the number of victims for modern slavery is around 40 million globally. More than 60% of them are in the Southeast Asian region, including China. So that's a big issue for companies in the region. But we managed to lobby the stock exchange together with others to get them to change the ESG disclosure requirements. I think it's one of the first major exchange in the world to do that. It was before all the extradition saga. It was a relatively non-political period of Hong Kong. So we managed to push that through without any political wrangling. So the stock exchange now requires all listed companies in Hong Kong to disclose and investigate whether their supply chain has any forced labor element or unfair employment practices. Now, I've yet to see how companies are doing this kind of investigation, because a lot of them are just box ticking exercise, which is the experience also with the UK Modern Slavery Act, and also less so in Australia, but also a lot of companies are just going through the motions, especially the UK Modern Slavery Act has no teeth to it, that companies can simply just tick the box and say, oh, well, this supplier told me that they have no modern slavery, but that is clearly not enough. And but changing my experience, I guess, from Hong Kong is that changing regulators' attitude and response to these kind of issues are much faster than, much more effective than having legislation, which is going to take years. So that's the first takeaway. My second takeaway is, I think, with the two other speakers, I just want to supplement that. The ESG, the S in the ESG is also about sustainability, right? So what we are seeing is that when Wall Street doubles down on investment in China, not only are they complicit in human rights violation by investing in companies that has supply chain issues, that has forced labor, that has factories in Xinjiang, that uses forced labor from the Uyghur community, but also it is inherently unsustainable for people to invest state pension funds of this country to China, and for several reasons. One, it is that we're seeing the regulatory decisions coming out of China to be increasingly erratic and irrational. They could wipe out a whole industry like what they did with the private education sector that has billions of dollars on the stock market. They could wipe it out in one day, because Xi Jinping said in 2019 that education security is very important for PRC. And what is education security? We must not allow foreign companies to run our education system. We must kick out all the foreign schools, and tuition is just not doesn't sit well with common prosperity, because poor families can't afford to send their kids to private education. So a whole sector wiped out overnight. And this is the domestic political situation in China right now, that they could pull out at the Ant Financial IPO within a week. They could say to Didi Chuxing that your IPO in New York was wrong. Come back and list in Hong Kong, which they're still finding it very difficult to do. But these are the decisions that you're seeing out of China. And also, I think on the bigger picture, we are not waking up to the geopolitical risks that we are facing. That after Ukraine, people may be starting to turn to look at the South China Sea, to look at Taiwan Strait, to ask themselves whether the risk of something happening over the Taiwan Strait is as low as before, or are we just deluding ourselves that Xi Jinping is not going to move in on Taiwan at some point in the future? And what happened if he does create a military conflict over the Taiwan Strait or South China Sea? All the investments that American company make in China could be wiped out overnight. You're talking about trillions of dollars. So that is the kind of risk that I don't think companies are willing to really be honest with themselves and their investors to say, are we too exposed to China? Is it an inherently stable and sustainable investment market that we could safely go into? And I think looking at the smaller kind of granular policy development, my last point is that I think China is getting ready for some kind of rupture with the West. Two pieces of news that came out recently that got me thinking about that. Recently, the Financial Times reported that yes, out of battery. It's unsustainable, this mic. So the last point that I want to point to is two pieces of news that got me thinking about a potential rupture with the West. One, it is the Financial Times reported that on the 21st of April, the People's Bank of China called in a lot of the top bankers around the country in China to ask them to start thinking how they could limit their exposure to Western sanctions. If China is sanctioned by the West the same way Russia is sanctioned, how can we protect ourselves? That is a very top decision that was made by People's Bank of China to ask banks around China to start thinking about that. Number two, they issue a memo to prohibit all senior CCP officials from owning overseas assets, and their kids are not allowed to study abroad. Now, this is also, I think, an important development because it is as if Xi Jinping and the top leadership of CCP are preparing for a major rupture with the West. Now, if Western companies are still sleeping or sleepwalking into China with pension funds, with investments, are we being too naive?
Thanks, Isaac. I get the sense you have something to add here.
So those were excellent points, Dennis. And just to jump on your point about a war, I think there's a real reluctance both in DC and elsewhere to talk about war because it makes people think that you're advocating for a war. I think that needs to change. There's a very real possibility that there will be a hot war between the US and China very soon, whether over Taiwan or a dozen other countries in Asia. And stating that fact doesn't mean you want that to happen. It means that that's a very real possibility. And I think sometimes this is diplomatic speak, but when Blinken says we're not trying to contain China, well, we are trying to contain China. That's been policy for quite some time. People say, well, we're getting into a new Cold War. We don't want a new Cold War. Well, we've been in a Cold War for quite some time. So fighting a trade war and a cyber war. So I think DC is used to being ahead of the business community these things and needs to continue to be more explicit on these things because otherwise it gives the business community cover to say, well, Blinken's saying we're not trying to contain China. So obviously we're going to continue to work with China, as opposed to people realizing, oh, so much of US policy is geared towards forcing US companies to reduce their exposure to China because that's against US national interest, and allowing us to be explicit about these things, explicit about the very real specter of war, makes it easier for companies, perhaps privately, and frankly, for a lot of them, private is the best solution, to start really having serious discussions at their boardrooms. Should we pull out of China because China could invade Taiwan or Japan or Vietnam, et cetera?
Jump on a couple of those points as well. I think that, I think that Dennis is absolutely right. I think, China gets a vote here. It's not just, sometimes when you're a policymaker, and especially I found this tendency to be true when I was in government, that we tend to think that everything that happens in the world is a result of what we do or our own actions, and forget that other countries out there have agency and that they are acting according to their own interests. I know that sounds like a pretty basic thing that you would want to incorporate into your foreign policy thinking, but you would be surprised how infrequently it's actually done, and how often, the decision making that's coming out of the State Department or the NSC is really like in this very blinkered kind of thinking about, oh, if we do this, then this will happen, or, we can't do this because then this will happen. Like, these countries have agencies, and China in particular has agency. And the fact they have been prepared. I mean, the whole dual circulation economy is about how do we become less dependent on the the West for things that we need to keep growing our economy and stay in control of the country and keep the Chinese Communist Party at the, as the paramount control of the country. And let's not ever forget that that is the number one goal of the party. It's not growing the economy. It's not even territorial integrity. Those things are a means to an end to ensure that they remain at the top of the pyramid. And I think that sometimes we forget these things when we are making policy, whether it's economic policy or security policy, and that we misprice risk all the time, because we aren't thinking, we're projecting and we're mirror imaging them and thinking about that their equities and their incentive structures look like ours when they actually do not at all, in very, very fundamental ways. So this gets at the problem, at the root of a lot of the policy problems. But this is why I think you also see, I want to say, Dennis, I agree with you that yes, it's faster to get the executive branch to act than it is to get the legislative branch to act. And certainly that's true in our system. But when the executive branch is captured to the financial services industry and they won't do stuff, you really need Congress to do it. And I'll give you two great examples. Since the PCAOB memo in 2012 that said that the Chinese companies that were not providing their audit reports to the United States, to the PCAOB, had to do this and that they would do it. And then what did China do after that? They passed laws saying, no, you will not. And these were MOUs that had been signed between the Chinese government and the US government. And then China went and passed laws saying that they were going to not allow companies to provide their audit reports. Now, this sounds like a dumb technical thing. And how many of you know what the PCAOB is? Like, if you raise your hand, if you know what the PCAOB is. I'm shocked that there is more than one person in the room. I know Robbie knows, but other than that, it stands for the Public Corporation Accountability Office. Wait, no, I cannot even remember. Public Company Oversight and Accounting Board or something like that. Anyway, I never even get it right. But this is, you have to give your audit reports to be listed on a US exchange. Every single Chinese company that is listed on the New York Stock Exchange right now, that is listed on NASDAQ, does not provide their audit reports to the PCAOB. Every US company that's listed on those exchanges has to. How is this fair if you're a US business? It's not, but this has been the case. We tried to get it through the administration, through the executive branch to solve this problem. It did not work. And so Congress passed a law called the Holding Foreign Companies Accountable Act that requires now that you will be delisted within a certain period of time if you do not provide your audit reports. It doesn't say China anywhere in the legislation. China's never mentioned, but they're the only company that doesn't comply. And so, or the only country that their companies don't comply. So they will be booted out unless, but still, even after Congress passes a law, PCAOB and the SEC are trying to cut another deal. They're going to buy the same rug again from the Chinese government with the same outcome. And so it's this iterative process that's going back and forth, Same thing's happening with Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. It's against the law to import products into the United States that contain forced labor. It has been against the law since the 1930s. But do you think that CPB or Customs and Border Patrol is out there every day checking to make sure that every company that's importing stuff into the country from China is fully in compliance? No, they are not. And we've had to, again, I look at the groups in this room that have done this incredible work to flip the presumption and say, we are now going to assume that any product that comes into the United States, the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act says, any product that comes into the United States from Xinjiang, we assume it has forced labor in it. And it's up to you, importer, to prove us wrong and prove otherwise. The burden of proof is on the importer to say that there is no forced labor in their supply chain bringing this product into the United States. We are expecting that this legislation, which is very clear, is not confusing at all, is being watered down right now as we speak, and that next week, when they issue the enforcement regulations on it, that they will be as weak as possible. This is the problem. I mean, and so it's just constant. You have to keep constantly doing this over and over and over again, saying, no, we really mean it. And Congress is going to have to come back and say, no, we really mean this. And they're going to shorten the period on delisting because of what's going on with PCAOB and the SEC. And they're going to come back and they're going to tell the agencies on Uyghur forced labor, no, you have to actually enforce this and you have to do it this way. And we're going to take away your waiver authorities and we're going to take away your flexibility if you keep doing this. But that's all it is. It's just got to keep happening. And fortunately it is happening, but it's painful. And none of it should have to be this hard. None of it.
I mean, I completely agree with you, Kelley. I mean, I think when it comes to the will to act from this administration, it really is lacking. And I think in particular, when it comes to the entities list, the fact that, the government's still dragging their feet regarding Hikvision, really. And, Hikvision has threatened a lawsuit against the government. I understand that, some former congressmen at one point were lobbying on behalf of Hikvision to ensure that they weren't going to be sanctioned on the list. But there is a real failure to act here. The list should be regularly updated. And again, this is what the research is trying to get to, is that there shouldn't be a loophole, really. If you're blacklisted, you're blacklisted. You should be able to invest in it. But again, you're seeing this sort of dragging of feet. Part of it, as you say, is the presumption and, the burden of proof. And I think until you reverse that burden of proof in regards to the sanctions list, where you say you have to prove why you shouldn't be on a sanctions list, the administration is going to continue to hide behind that. And that's certainly something we see at the moment when it comes to subsidiaries of the companies who are on the sanctions list, who still have a loophole and a way out, which is completely ridiculous. And I think the other thing that you sort of allude to is also this stuff around VIE structures and the fact that why is more action not being taken on VIE structures? Why is it the Chinese government that's now trying to force Chinese companies that have VIE structures like Alibaba and Tencent through the Cayman Islands to return home, when actually the US should have been doing this all along, because there's no recourse, basically. There's another crackdown against Alibaba or Tencent. Say goodbye to your money, basically. And yet you're still seeing these pension funds heavily investing in Alibaba and Tencent.
VIE is actually a huge problem. Sam would know this, he being a corporate lawyer. That is basically former corporate lawyer. But still, I mean, VIEs is basically illegal in China. That it is not something that you could enforce, even under Chinese law, that you're investing in bubbles. But the auditors sign off on it, the law firms sign off on it to say that it's okay, then it kind of became okay, but it's just ridiculous.
One of the scariest things is that one of the people who created the whole VIE structure in the first place is a guy named Gary Gensler. You know what he does right now? He's the chairman of the Securities and Exchange Commission.
I think on this idea of Chinese law as well, there's a sense in China, there's an expression where the policies are above and the ways around the policies are below. Companies don't follow Chinese law. If they did, it'd be a much, much harder place to do business. But what you do is you have this situation where Chinese norms are now very often opposed to US laws. And we talk to a lot of corporate counsels and they're pulling their hair out, trying to figure out what to do. Because you're mentioning the box checking exercises. So companies are in a position where they're putting their suppliers in danger by asking them to certify whether or not there's forced labor in their factories. So if there is forced labor in their factories, they're not going to say, oops, well, we didn't pay this person for 3 weeks, but they look fine. They're going to say, no forced labor in this factory. And if they do say, well, I see forced labor in this other factory, that can be a violation of Chinese law. They can get themselves in trouble there. And I think we should also, as we're having this conversation, mention that there's huge risks for Chinese people and Chinese employees of global companies on these issues. I think the comparison between Nazi Germany and China is mostly overblown, with the exception of the situation in Xinjiang. And if you're running a factory in Nazi Germany in, say, January 1939, and you're one of the righteous Nazis employing dozens of Jews, and someone calls you and says, are these Jews working coerced, or can I be public about this? Can we talk about this on an open line? You're just putting them in danger. You're jeopardizing the way that allows for the safety of these people. Second, when we talked about war, I'm quite worried about the situation where the US and China are at war, and the hundreds of thousands of Chinese who have worked and work for American companies are suddenly seen as enemy combatants. And so I think there's a real humanitarian reason for global companies to reassess their China exposure, because head of McKinsey, the head of Boeing, the head of all of these companies, Boeing is a defense contractor. US and China are fighting a war. I don't really think the head of Boeing in China, or the top Boeing officials who are Chinese citizens, a lot of them who don't have US passports, are just going to be let to re-engage fully with the Chinese system. I think there's going to be very, very real risks for them as well. I think that should include in the equation.
So we are going to start, as you're all thinking about questions, because we'll move into the Q&A. I did want to just to sort of pick up on we were talking about the ESG indexes earlier, a couple of other themes to pick up on. So, Kelley, we've seen recently the UN Human Rights Commissioner made this much ballyhooed trip to China and Xinjiang, and she came out of it essentially parroting the CCP's talking points, rather than actually calling them out on, the overwhelming evidence of crimes against humanity and genocide. So, you've worked within the UN, you've seen the mechanics of how this works. Do you think, well, what is the role of sort of multilateral organizations like the UN setting standards, setting guidelines for global financial markets? Or maybe the question is, what should or could the role be? Yeah.
Okay, so one of the reasons we're in the mess that we're in with ESG right now is because of the way that ESG was basically created and birthed by the UN out of the Global Compact. And the UN, I mean, bless their hearts, as we say in the South, they thought that they could sit down with a bunch of bankers, the biggest banks in the world, 20 of them to be exact, and say, hey, we want you to invest in development and help us achieve our sustainable development goals. And we're, how do you feel about that? And they're like, can we make money? And they're like, sure, why not? Okay, then yeah, we're all in. So instead of, but the UN, again, bless their hearts, they really thought that these companies, these banks, these big banks, were doing this because they believed in the sustainable development goals. Even though the banks came in and said, can we make money while we're doing this? And that was their, precondition for being involved in it. They really thought, oh, we'll make them a party to the SDGs, and we'll co-opt the world's largest banks and make them development partners. What do you think happened? Not that. So what you saw was instead the financialization of ESG, and it turned into a marketing and branding tool for the financial services industry globally. And that's what it is. At the end of the day, ESG is a marketing and branding tool for asset managers, bankers, who, you name it, people who spend their days making money for a living. And so the idea that the UN is now going to try to fix the problem through anything and through any means is I think not tenable. I think that they now are stuck within this framework. They both underestimated the attractiveness of what they were putting out there and overestimated their ability to control this problem or to control this monster that they've created. And so, they're as much at fault with their naivete or whatever you want to call it. I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt and say it was naivete and not something else. But so that's where the UN sits on this. And then you have a very weak Secretary General who is completely in the pocket of China, which is working very steadily to transform the UN into something that is much more useful, a much more useful tool for China. And every day working very hard at that, putting a lot of resources into it, a lot more resources than we and the other democratic countries are putting into it, and doing it in ways that we couldn't, even if we wanted to, because we can't straight up bribe the Secretary General by giving him $10 million a year to play with and fund money, which the Chinese do. It's called the UN Peace and Development Fund. You can look it up. It's not a secret, it's a real thing. And we can't do that. You know, our Congress would go insane if the US government tried to give the Secretary General an unfettered fund of $10 million a year for 10 years. That just would never happen. So we're in a situation where the UN also has this bias toward dictatorship, especially toward left-wing dictatorships, but definitely a bias toward dictatorship within the UN system. It's hardwired into the system. And so we're seeing the limits of it on everything from the UN Security Council's inability to deal with pretty much anything to the way that China has been able to insinuate itself into all of these UN agencies and very effectively. So I don't think that the UN is part of the solution. I think they are actually part of the problem at this point. And I would add the World Economic Forum and all these other, you know, the going all the way to the COP and all of the climate stuff. I mean, the GFANS, the Global Finance, what is it? I can't even remember what it stands for, but it's the financial vehicle that Mark Carney has set up to do. You know, this is like ESG on steroids, right? He's got all these banks to commit all this money for climate change and remediation and everything, and it's like, okay, yeah, this is going to work great. I mean, it's just insane. It's insane to me that this keeps happening, and people keep, you know, falling for this scam over and over again. It's beggars belief on some level.
No, we come for the candor, Kelley. So my last question, and then want to open it up to you, is to you, Sam, right? Because most of the people in this room have a 401k or a 403b, or, you know, some kind of a fund that is going to be by default sort of involved in, you know, this passive investment. So what can we do, you know, to bring about some of the change that you're talking about?
Yeah, I mean, I think Kelley said it earlier about the TSP and the fact that they're now considering for the first time to allow it to be invested outside of American stock exchanges and probably managed, no doubt, by BlackRock in the future. So there's a window of activity really for everybody who's involved in that scheme. And we've had some success in the UK. I mean, we did in the last report, we looked at the Parliamentary Staffers Pension Fund, and we found that they were exposed to equities linked to Xinjiang. And they basically wrote to Legal & General, the largest pension fund in the UK, and we had a big meeting with them where they basically raked them over the coals. And it was really embarrassing. But given the senior level of people Legal & General said, they were clearly very vulnerable to the public criticism they received. Now, are they going to change course on this? Probably not. But I think you need that kind of grassroots activism. You need people asking where their money is going. You need people banding together. There are enough people who work for the federal government. If fraction of them take an interest in their pension scheme and start asking questions about it, they can move the dial a bit. And I think the same is probably said at a state level as well. I think there's a sort of nascent growing movement on student campuses that you're seeing at the moment in relation to endowment funds. I think that's great. I hope that spreads like wildfire. I think they might run into a bit of trouble because a third of a lot of these endowment funds is managed by private equity. And that's a whole nother conversation. That's a real black box in terms of not knowing where their holdings are. But I think, as Dennis said, we're in a better place because people have woken up really to the threat of China. They're having more serious conversations about really where the leverage is, right? And the leverage is finance, right? And if you get Wall Street and you get the City of London, you get some of the financial centers working together on this and actually introducing some common sense regulation. And again, it doesn't have to be a punitive thing. This is a growing industry. There is money to be made. But I think, as Kelley says, you have to put it into law. You can't expect them to just do it out of the goodness of their hearts. It's never going to happen. And just as a final point from me, I think what's interesting is, of course, in 2008 and 2009, Wall Street crashed the global economy by selling CDOs, things that they knew were very risky prospects. And I looked back in March at the holdings of the top 5 banks that received the largest bailouts from the US government. I think it's Citigroup and Morgan Stanley. Citigroup's got 21 billion invested in China last year. That was their state position. Morgan Stanley had 23 billion, I believe. And they both received 25 billion each from the federal government in 2008, 2009. So their holdings in China are now nearly bigger than the amount of money that they needed in the last bailout. So if something goes wrong in China, that's a problem. Like, I'm not worried about BlackRock because they're big enough that they can survive. I'm worried about the US financial institutions that are following them down the rabbit hole who may not survive.
All right, so over to all of you. Questions, please. If you could share your name and introduce yourselves, and then go from there.
Hi, my name is Yuchi. I'm a grad student at Georgetown University. Thanks so much for this. I have a question for Sam. So I'm sure you looked at CalPERS, which is, California's pension fund, the biggest in the nation. They hired for their chief investment officer a Chinese American who worked for the 1,000 Talents program back in the United States. And then members of Congress wrote a letter to California saying, hey, what's up with this? And then California and California Fashion said this is anti-Asian racism. But a couple months later, he was surreptitiously let go. And I was wondering, throughout the course of your research, did you find examples where, whether it be United Front or other sort of Chinese pressure elements, have encouraged or really pushed pension funds to invest in China and don't listen to the haters, China? And have you seen that sort of pressure effort, or is this really just mostly just Americans just wanting to make money?
I mean, we haven't seen a lot of United Front work around pension funds, but to be honest, I think, and maybe some of the other panelists want to weigh on this one, like, the biggest cheerleaders for getting into China are American firms, basically. Whether they've been co-opted or not, like BlackRock or whatever, is another question. But I think, to be honest, the United Front don't really need to encourage some of the pension funds to be doing this because
They're doing it now.
Exactly. I think Ben Mong was a Schwartzman guy. I think he's the one who helped get him that job. And yeah, you don't need, when you have someone like that doing it, it's far more effective than if there's a United Front official.
Make the foreign work for China.
What I can share with you from my experience in Hong Kong is that the United Front does work on the financial capitals, and how the red capital in Hong Kong really changed the nature of our financial market to a point where China can say, we don't really need international financial capital. We can use and rely on the red capital that's already in Hong Kong. That is really the dominant player in the market. That's why they could afford to do what they did to Hong Kong, because a lot of people think, why would they do that to Hong Kong? They need the international community and financial. Well, first of all, the banks are not going anywhere, and they know it. And they made that calculation that they were right, essentially, that the financial institutions will not do anything, even if they destroy one country, two system, because the financial institution were already relying on so much red capital as their business source. So they're making tons of money. And why would they do anything and leave? So I think that the kind of same kind of calculation is being had over the US financial institutions. They're all rushing into the Chinese financial market as they open up. But no one is asking the obvious question: what if they change policy tomorrow? What will happen to all those investments?
Well, I think this is why you also see, like, every Chinese firm that is listed on a US exchange is dual listed on Shenzhen or Hong Kong or Shanghai, and they're going to keep doing that, and they're going to, what I read of the regulatory announcements at the end of last year was that, yeah, if you want to go do an IPO in London or Hong Kong, or in London or New York or whatever, that's fine. But really, you really should do it in Hong Kong, because that's better for everybody. And I think that they're not going to prohibit companies from coming and doing IPOs here, but they are going to make it such an unattractive option for them. And we're doing our part to make it unattractive in some ways too, which is, fine. But I think that what we've got to, also think about when we're talking about some of this stuff is that it's not enough that that we do kind of make sure that we're inoculating ourselves when it comes to the United Front. I think that we also have to, yes, the foreign companies, the international banks do a great job of doing this for the Chinese, but the United Front work operates on so many different levels. I think that where we're going to see the biggest problem is in private equity. And you look at Sequoia, look at what's happening with Sequoia, look at what's happening with Tiger. And it's so much more opaque than we have so many problems with what's happening in the open markets, what we can see, what has to be disclosed, what has to be where you do have. I think the biggust danger right now is this combination of everything moving into the Chinese markets and out of our markets. And so again, as much as I'm like kind of like, please delist, I'm also like, they delist, we're still dumping capital into them. And then also, it's the private equity that really, I think you're right, private equity, because it is so opaque and we have so little visibility into what's going on there. And it's the round tripping private equity that's coming back into the United States. What I call the small, smart money. It's not huge amounts of money, but it's investing in strategic industries in the United States. It's investing in our bleeding edge Silicon Valley stuff. It's, helping these countries get through the valley of death by owning an equity share in them. And then they come out on the other side. And, it's the stuff that's happening there that's totally off the radar is what really, really keeps me up at night, more so even than what's going on in the capital markets.
Hi, my name is Mason. I'm affiliated with a number of places, including Georgetown and formerly some organizations in Hong Kong. But my question is about the regulatory capture issue that was mentioned by Ambassador Currie, and with regards to some of the companies that are mentioned in this report. For example, Hikvision, Dahua Technologies, iFlyTech. Many of these companies have contracts with state and local governments, with local police departments in the United States, with school districts to provide temperature monitors, things like that. Now, I know in the past, with regard to, say, Iran sanctions, state governments have had some role, like DFS in New York has had a role in enforcing Iran sanctions. So do you think a push to pass state and local or even city municipal level bans on contracts with these companies, state laws to try to force divestment from, say, like CalPERS or other major pension funds, do you think there might be more productivity at the state level than at the federal level?
So, great question. There we go. I really want to bring in the idea of campaigning and public shame with a lot of these things, because I would say it's going to be far more effective for one official to paint his rival as too pro-Beijing. I hope they don't use other language, they tend to, but I think the idea is, oh, you have Hikvision cameras in our streets, that's dangerous for our children, look how you're helping the communists, is a far more effective reason to change that than this is illegal and you have to pay a $50,000 fine.
In my conversations with attorney general, with state attorney generals, state financial officers, they are very much, a year ago, not so clued in on this, now much more so, and very interested in trying to figure out what to do. For instance, I know the Republican Governors Association at the state level has set up the Republican Governors Association and the Republican Attorney Generals Association have both set up working groups and set up, and you've got model legislation circulating at the state level. You've got this state university endowment issue going on. There is a lot of activity at this level already happening. Florida and Texas, West Virginia have all, and I think Utah is going to be the next state that's about to do something in this space. So, and it is freaking out. Some of these companies are especially so BlackRock was forced to hire state lobbyists for the first time in their history because their involvement in the state pension funds in Texas and it was being threatened by some of these activities, and they've had to go in and actually do lobbying in Austin and in other places to try to preserve their business there. They've been kicked out of West Virginia. BlackRock has been kicked out of West Virginia. Now, big part of it was because of coal, because of their ESG activism against fossil fuels. But the number 2 reason that West Virginia gave for kicking BlackRock out of their state pension fund was China. So this is happening, and it's definitely, you know, right now, I think because of the regulatory capture problem at the federal level and the revolving door between these firms and I mean, again, like Gary Gensler, the head of Brian Deese, who's the head of the National Economic Council, or BlackRock, Blackstone, Blackwater, one of them, you know, I keep that, they all run together in my brain, but he used to work for Ray Dalio, whichever one is that. So, you know, they're all, it's like the most incestuous between Treasury and the SEC and the White House NEC and these big firms. It's just a revolving door. So I think at the federal level, we're kind of stuck right now because of those capture issues. I think that there's a lot that can be done at the state level because they all are making their own way on this.
I mean, just to add, I mean, we've been discussing this issue in the UK quite a lot recently because we've got a procurement bill at the moment. And we spoke with the government about this, and they think there's maybe 1 million Hikvision cameras in the UK. And the big pushback that they're getting is just the cost of actually removing these cameras, replacing these cameras. And that's something that state governments are going to have to think about. I completely agree with you. Like, there's a blueprint piece of legislation and one state's the first mover on that can be replicated across the whole of the United States. And that's why actually, to be honest, the different activism that's going on at state level should be encouraged and sort of fostered, really, sort of find a way forward.
Hi, I'm Alex Chow from Hong Kong Democracy Council. Really thanks, Sam, for producing a brilliant report. My question is more related to panelists' assessment on what folks can do in the US concerning China policy, because it seems all our panelists are having a quite pessimistic or critical assessment on the current administration. And my question is actually related to 3 episodes that we had with conversation with. So one episode is we talked to State Department officials. So when it comes to sanction, he is saying the administration doesn't have enough political will to push forward for more sanction. And that could be explained or interpreted as a way that perhaps the administration has different priority, or maybe it doesn't have enough bandwidth. But we just wonder then if the current administration would not have enough willpower, then what would be the focus in your views? Just because right now we might also be talking to Congress people, but we know there will be a flip in the midterm election. And if the current administration is gonna be weak or relatively moderate, then what would you foresee in perhaps next 2 years? Because another episode that we spoke to was about we talked to folks who advised Secretary Pompeo on China policy, and we actually being very honest, asked him about their assessment on President Trump and also Pompeo on where their stance concerning China policy, whether President Trump would be tough enough when it comes to China policy. Because as a Hong Konger, when we look back at what happened in 2019, some of the policies concerning Hong Kong could be contradicting sometimes, and the messaging could be confusing. So we just wonder if the administration, the current one, would not be that promising, and there may be some great changes in the future. Then what might be your assessment concerning what might happen in the next 2 years, and whether folks should spend more time with the Congress people as Ambassador Kelley Currie said, or the administration might also have some leverage, and whether a new administration will have enough political power.
So the political element that is the most resistant to tough on Beijing policies is a progressive left. And probably the main reason for that is they find it racist. And part of the reason for that is the China field in the US is very white male. And there's this perception in the United States and white female. There's a perception in the United States that
Actually, it's pretty much white.
there's a perception that being anti-Beijing means being anti-Chinese, and people don't realize the very obvious truth that so many people in China and so many people in Hong Kong are anti-Beijing. And so I would actually say there's a huge need to go after more progressive city governments and progressive areas and advocating for them and being those voices. California, Oregon, Maine, Massachusetts, let people know that this really matters to you. I think that's incredibly important.
Isaac's uniquely positioned to say that. I would, yeah, I mean, you know how I feel that Congress is the inflection point right now, because they're the only ones who are, you put your finger on it. For a variety of reasons, the Biden administration's China policy is incoherent. I frequently refer to it as bipolar, schizophrenic. It is literally, they go out, have Blinken give a speech about, blah, 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 blah. They go and do all this stuff in Asia with the Quad. And then they come back here, they waive sanctions on Chinese solar producers that we know are using forced labor. We know that. We have just gobs of evidence of it. And they waive tariffs on them for 2 years. They now are about to weekly, you do the weakest possible implementation of the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. They are trying to negotiate, like their life depends on it, to undermine the Holding Foreign Companies Accountable Act. What did they do yesterday? They're waiving more tariffs, waiving, Trump era tariffs on Chinese products that they know, they admitted to journalists that they know that they will have no impact on inflation, but they're going to waive the tariffs anyway, because it makes it look like they're doing something on inflation. So how do you go out there and say you're having this China policy that's X that is trying to make us less dependent, that's trying to make our supply chains more resilient, blah, 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 blah. And then you come back and you do these things literally in the same week. It's incoherent is a nice word for it. So Congress it's hard. It's a pain in the butt dealing. I used to work on the Hill. It's very difficult. It's toxic right now too, but there is a level of convergence. And we have, there's a similar problem on the right where this kind of horseshoes around where, Chinese dictatorship doesn't look so bad. They can get stuff done kind of on the new right, as it were. And that's where you saw some of the incoherence in the Trump administration policy too, which I fully admit was there because Donald Trump believed, he thought, God, Xi Jinping's got it great. He doesn't have to run for re-election. He gets to appoint himself leader for life. And so you will continue to see that. I think the state level is really, really, because the next leaders in Washington at the federal level, they come from the state level. And so not only are you getting stuff done at the state level where we're all locked up here in Washington, but you're impacting and influencing the people who are going to be in Washington in the next administration, who are going to be here in the next Congress, who are, that's our pipeline for leadership. And so I really encourage people to go down to the state level, get to know state. And if you don't think that the Chinese are at the subnational level at the Chinese Communist Party and the United Front, that's where the United Front is working, is heavily, heavily at the subnational level.
No, I just want to echo, it is important why Chinese people need to speak up, especially on these issues. Someone told me, not me, I didn't say this, but say that the Chinese policy space is male, pale, and Yale. It's not from me, but I think there is a lot of room for Chinese people to speak up, and that's the reason why I want to do that. Why HKDC also needs to do more is because we need to tell people this is not about anti-China. We're Chinese and we're not anti ourselves, but this is about authoritarianism.
Yeah, I mean, if America isn't going to get together a coherent China policy, then what are the rest of us going to do? Sit outside watching America in the UK or Europe or in Canada or Australia? I think the sooner there's a coherent policy, you can start putting together a sort of democratic coalition to get this thing going. Because I think at the moment, there's a lot to be done. I'm quite optimistic about the new Congress. I don't know whether I should be. Who knows what the midterms are going to throw up, but I think despite having very depressing meetings on the Hill all week, I feel like there is an impetus to do something on China. And I think that actually the margins between the Democrats and the Republicans and some of this stuff is not that far apart. So my hope is that Congress can get its act together, get something done, may hopefully get the US Competes Act through. If not, get something in the next Congress. But again, like, is that going to force the administration to be more active in the next 2 years? I don't know. But yeah, clearly something needs to happen.
Yeah, really fascinating discussion. Thanks so much to all the panelists. I'm Morgan. I'm the program associate with the China team here at IRI. And so while reading the report and while formulating some questions and drafting some questions, it really struck me how ESG as a whole, there's the environmental component and then there's the social and human rights component. And many times, I think, especially in the renewable energy sector, those two components butt heads completely, as Ambassador Currie was mentioning. The whole renewable energy supply chain with the rare earth elements is completely muddled and stuck in Xinjiang, forced labor. And how are we going to enforce that? Like, how, if we reroute it to Southeast Asia, I'm sure you can tie it back to Xinjiang somehow, because China just has a monopoly on all of these rare earth elements. And I was wondering if anyone has any opinions on how do we formulate, if ESG isn't working right now, how do we formulate another concept that would maybe address or, you know, better inform the renewable energy sector or any of these companies developing these technologies, how to at the same time prioritize the environment, which is obviously important, but also addressing their human rights issues. And I don't know, Isaac, if you in your practice have run into that issue, or if anyone else has any thoughts on that. Thanks so much.
This is actually a good last question of sort of what's the alternative here? What's another way to approach this?
So China has a lock on the rare earth supply chain as opposed to rare earths production. And because it's so polluting to mine rare earths, and we haven't really figured out what to do with thallium processing, that's a big reason why the supply chains are captured. But I do feel like, and again, this is so boring and it's so vanilla, but the more transparent we are about these things, the better ESG actually works. So when companies like Hikvision, which make surveillance cameras for concentration camps, get high ESG scores, it just makes the whole system seem quite silly. You know, how can China Construction Bank be in a ESG fund that Brown University, you know, invests in? For some things, I'm a revolutionary. For this, I feel like it can be fixed within the system. And I think letting people know that they have alternative ESG investments, and there's not that many of them yet, but it's starting. There's something called Life and Liberty Indexes, which someone named Perthol does. It's a dictator light, yeah, she's fantastic, a dictator light ETF. Letting people understand that you can be very environmentally conscious, you can be very light on China, and you can make a lot of money is also another thing. And as companies start to do that, I think that'll be very impactful. And I do feel like individuals and companies need to understand there is quite a first mover advantage for a lot of these things. So we're not yet in the era where a Fortune 500 CEO has publicly come out against China, but we're real close. And that person who's going to do it, you know, probably fairly soon is going to get a lot of positive press for that. And I feel like that'll be true about the ESG era and the ESG industry as well.
So first, I think we have to understand that there are trade-offs in everything. And I think that part of the magical thinking around ESG that was put out by a lot of the financial services industry, and I'm looking at you, Larry, is that you can do this, you can be, you can do well by doing good. Like this whole, we're just going to make money by saving the planet. Like, yeah, no, that's not how it is. I think also it has taken us decades to get into the mess that we've gotten ourselves into with supply chains, and we're seeing it now with inflation, right? I'm not an economist. I don't even play one on TV, but I can see that the fact that China depressed prices through the China price for decades and basically allowed us to do things to defy economic gravity for decades because we didn't have to deal with inflation because China was literally keeping the prices of stuff so low that we, and here we are today. Look, behold, the consequences of my own actions. Like, what did we think with, that which cannot continue won't. We are now hitting the wall and we're hitting it, and it's going to be painful and it's going to be incredibly dislocating and ugly. And, instead of pretending like you can get rid of sanction or get rid of tariffs and it's going to solve inflation, it would be helpful if our political leadership would have like adult conversations and treat us like adults and recognize that there are trade-offs. There are trade-offs. If we pay people more to do basic, low skill jobs in this country, prices are going to go up. If the labor market, but we can't talk to, our politicians don't talk to us like adults. They treat us like infants, and that we can have everything and that unicorns and fairies are going to magically appear and make all of our problems go away. That's, it's going to be bad. And you can't have cheap solar panels that rely on forced labor and the polysilicon at the base of the supply chain for solar. Polysilicon's in everything, in every photovoltaic cell that comes out. You cannot destroy the solar market here, the solar production capabilities here, let China own the whole supply chain, and then, expect that, oh, wait, there's forced labor. Now we have to, but the price can't go up. And it's just, we've got to be adults about this, and you've got to tell people, treat them like adults and understand that there are trade-offs. Jinko Solar cannot continue to import solar panels into the United States as long as they are continuing to use forced labor in Xinjiang. And they are continuing to use forced labor in Xinjiang right now today, but they're still also able to import solar panels into the United States right now today. This has got to stop on some level. And when you poll people and you ask them, are you willing to pay more for a solar panel that does not have forced labor in it? They say yes. But if you're going to pretend like, we're not, people are not stupid. They know when things are not right. They're not dumb, but our government continues to act like they are. The worst is BYD, actually, the battery manufacturers that have all these critical minerals in them, and they're on, ESG lists. They're, because they're making clean, renewable energy. I'm like, have you seen the mines that this stuff comes out of and the processing facilities that it's not, it's just, so they've either got to get serious about ESG and make it real, and that means like all the way down the whole supply chain, or they've got to acknowledge that it's a marketing and branding exercise and it's nonsense, and actually come up with something else that's real, that actually does, acknowledge that there are trade-offs. And ESG doesn't allow for trade-offs. It tells everybody you can, eat candy all day and there'll be no consequences. And it's literally, it's infantile. I don't know how else to describe it.
I certainly agree with that. I think, ESG is an invitation for a conversation with every pension fund, every financial institution. So in some ways, even though I'm still not quite sure whether they're naive about ESG or whether they're just being duplicit, I think it's a great tool for human rights organizations because it just gives us an excuse to badger the hell out of these companies and point out their gross hypocrisy. So in some ways, I kind of like ESG, but I agree with you, like there has to be something real behind it. And if they just want to do the E, fine, get rid of the S and the G, but they're not even really doing the E. And I think that's the point that both of you were making. And I think, again, like with the pension side of things, if you were honest with people and you said, look, you're going to get less returns on your pensions, maybe more of it will be going directing to, say, domestic infrastructure, because it's not like the infrastructure in this country doesn't need some improvement. I think people will get behind that. Manufacturing, let's restart manufacturing for solar in this country. Let's use pension fund money to do it. I think there's innovative ways of doing it and dealing with the problem. As you say, like, are the politicians willing to have a mature discussion about that? And are the people in Wall Street as well? So, I don't know.
All right, well, we are going to wrap up here. As promised, as I said, we sort of scratched the surface, but this was an incredibly fascinating discussion and wide-ranging discussion. And so I would like to, thank our panelists for joining us today. If we can give them all a round of applause. And so again, thank you to Hong Kong Watch for this incredible report. Thank you all for joining us today. And we look forward to seeing you again and for what I'm guessing is the next installment of this research. Thanks, Sam.